Alrighty, good morning. I'm going to start our anatomy unit today. So I'm going to go over just some basic vocabulary that we use when we're talking about anatomy. This is basically, I think, one of the last units that we'll have time for. My guess is this unit will take us most of the month of April, and then depending on what time we have left over, we can go more in depth into one of the body systems that you are most interested in. So, but I kind of just give you an overview for this one. So, alrighty, anatomy is, when we talk about anatomy and physiology, we're talking about the classification of the structures of an organism. So specifically, we're talking about what their body parts and their pieces and how they're put together. It's not how they work, but just what parts and pieces they have and how it's put together. So another word that sometimes is used in place of anatomy is morphology. It's kind of an older term. Specifically, you're talking about the shape, not necessarily the organization, just the shape and the structure. So maybe what bones and where are the bones located, that would be the morphology. The organization might be how are these, put in relation to another. So you can have a lot of different subspecialties underneath anatomy depending on what you're studying. I know for some people that are going to do like conservation or maybe are going to be more involved in the animal side, they have to take more specific anatomy classes. So gross anatomy is going to be talking about larger structures. Gross in biology speak just means large or the overall picture. Histology is going to be the study and function of the tissues that make up the anatomy parts. So you'd be looking at the different tissues that make up the human body, for example, or maybe the different tissues that make up dogs and cats if you were studying to be a veterinarian. And then you've also got applied anatomy or comparative anatomy or evolutionary anatomy, and those are going to be really specific subspecialties that you really probably won't use unless you're going into that. Like if you're doing conservation, you might do comparative. If you're studying for like historical biology or geology, you might go into the evolutionary to see the relationships between different organisms and how they've evolved over time or changed over time. Physiology is the secondary part to all of this. So anatomy is the shape and structure. Physiology is going to be the function. How do those parts and pieces work? So again, you can have different subspecialties underneath these. You can have pathophysiology. Patho meaning disease causing. So how does a disease affect the functionality of a part? And then again, you can have comparative or evolutionary physiology. You could have exercise physiologies if you're going to do physical therapy. So you can also have environmental physiology as well. So these aren't an inclusive list. An all specific group. There's more subspecialties. So that was just giving you kind of an idea. Sometimes you'll hear anatomy referred to as form and function or form versus function. Whenever we're talking about the form of an organism, we're referencing its anatomy. When we refer to its function, we're referring to physiology. So just kind of some extra words to be aware of. The function of a part is going to depend on how it's put together. So the example that I've used before is a lot of mammals have the same bones in their upper arm and lower arm and extremities. However, depending on the function is going to determine how those bones are actually arranged. For example, if you look at your hand, we've got, your hand muscle, and then you've got your fingers coming off of it. Well, in a bat, and we've got the arm. If you looked at a bat, They're going to have the same basic bones, but they're going to be organized differently because we don't fly. So our arms are not used for flying. So therefore they are structured the way they are. With bats, their arms are about the same, but they also have that tissue that forms the actual wing. And so their finger bones are much longer, and their hand bones are much longer than human hands, because they need to be able to hold that tissue that holds on to the tissues that allow them to fly, that make up the wing part of their body. And so their structure is different based on their need to fly. Hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, I'll try to find a picture for you at some point so you can kind of see that. So I want to say there's 9 characteristics that all living organisms have in common with one another. If you are living, you kind of go by these 9 characteristics. The first being you exhibit or you show a high degree of organization and complexity. Even a bacteria is more complex than, say, a rock. Now, obviously, a human being is more complex than a bacteria, but overall, in comparison to non-living organisms, living organisms have a higher degree of organization and complexity. This is part of the cell theory, but in order to be considered living, you have to be made of 1 or more cells. And you have to be able to acquire energy from cellular respiration. All living things go through cellular respiration to gain that ATP. From the tiny bacteria to sponges to people. The fourth thing that all living things need to be able to do is they need to be able to reproduce organisms that are similar to themselves. Not like looking exactly the same, like with your parents, if both parents have brown hair, it doesn't mean that you're going to produce a kid that has brown hair similar. It means you're going to produce an organism that's going to look like another human being, a head, 2 arms, 2 legs, can walk, is upright, is bipedal, 5 fingers and toes, or 10 fingers and toes, things like that. Obviously, there are times where something occurs and, they may not have the exact same structures, due to an abnormality. They may only have, 9 fingers or something, but technically they're still very similar. Not like a bear produces an animal that's similar to a dog or something like that, or a bird, The fifth thing that all living organisms have in common with one another is that they all are going to carry DNA on these structures called genes, which I know we've talked about. And these genes are going to be placed, or going to make up your chromosomes, large segments and pieces of your DNA. So your chromosomes are made of DNA. Your chromosomes are just long pieces of DNA that are going to have multiple genes encoded on them. So, number 6, they have to be able to grow and develop. So when I say grow and develop, it's 2 separate things, although sometimes you think of them as being very similar. Growth is referring to getting larger in size, so all infant organisms are smaller than their parent organism. So eventually, to gain adulthood, they will grow in size. And then they will also develop, which means they will become more complex. So more than likely, you will stop growing at some point in your life, but theoretically, you will never stop developing. Hopefully, you'll always be gaining new abilities and things like that. So, 7th thing that all living organisms exhibit is that they respond to their internal and external environment and react appropriately. So, if it's really, really hot outside, your body might trigger something and you'll start sweating. So that would be you responding to an external stimulus. Your heart beating faster, which might cause you to breathe more, take more breaths. That would be an internal stimulus. You have to be metabolically active. So that kind of goes in hand with the cellular respiration part. You're going to go through different chemical reactions to create that energy. And then your last thing is that you, in order to be considered living, you have to exhibit movement, internally and or externally. So almost all of our organisms will actually move at some point in time, even organisms that don't look like they would, like a coral, for example. Coral, for the most part, you think of it as being stationary or sessile, meaning it doesn't move. But there is one part in its life cycle where it actually is mobile. So, but then things like they have to be able to exhibit that movement maybe inside. So maybe they don't necessarily show that movement outside, but they might inside, within. Okay, so we've got a couple of anatomical positions that I want to go over. These are referenced mostly in the medical community, just so people have a common language instead of saying something's above it or behind it. So we use these anatomical positions to kind of clarify it a little bit more. Anterior and posterior. This refers to usually an organ, and we're going to refer to the front side of an organ being anterior and the back side being posterior. So like the front side of your heart would be anterior, the back side would be posterior. So, and that'll just be in like a normal what's it called? A diagram. They would say this is the posterior view of the heart or something like that. By the way, these kind of go in pairs. Your dorsal and your ventral go together. Dorsal refers to the back side of an organism, and then ventral refers to the stomach side. Reason why we don't use front and back side is because if you think about it, people versus say a dog. So we are bipedal, a dog is quadrupedal, meaning that it walks on 4 legs. So what's the front side of an organism there? I mean, because our front side would be fairly obvious enough for us. However, what would be the front side of the dog? Is that his stomach? Is that just the his face and his chest and maybe the first front paws? So that's where we kind of get into confusion and why we need these common languages of stomach side versus back side. So the way I remember this one is that dorsal implies like the dorsal fin of an animal. So that's on the back side, like a dolphin. And then ventral is just on your stomach side. Proximal and distal are referencing how close you are to the torso of your body. If your body part is closer to your torso, we say that it is more proximal. If it's further away, we say it's distal, which should make sense, I think. So your elbow is more proximal than your hand. Your foot is more distal than your knee. So, and then we've got your superior and inferior terms. Superior is referencing something that is above another object, and inferior is referring to something that is below an object. So your head would be superior to your heart. And then your stomach is inferior to your brain, or below. The awkward person there in the doodle, they're standing with their palms facing forward and their hand part facing towards the back. That's because, again, that's how, when we're referencing anatomical positions, because if you turned your hand the way it normally falls, you wouldn't know if we were talking about something that was stomach side versus, so dorsal versus ventral, we wouldn't necessarily know what you were talking about, but because the palm is facing out, like the same position that your stomach is on, we would say that that would be a ventral side. So, so those are your anatomical positions. Your next thing that we're going to talk about are the different planes. So if I were to slice you in half somewhere. So a plane is just an imaginary line drawn through the body that separates it into two parts, not necessarily equal parts, just two parts. The first plane is called the transverse plane. Sometimes this is called a cross section. Basically, if I stood you upright and I sliced you through the stomach all the way through and divided you into a top half and a bottom half, that would be the transverse view. So CAT scans, when they send you through, and CT scans, when you see, the inside and it's just a circle, that would be a transverse view of the body. The second way would be sagittally. If I cut you on a sagittal plane, that means that I would be cutting you into a right and left side. And then the last one would be a frontal plane, and that would be as if I cut you into a dorsal and a ventral side. So if I sliced you in half, like through the skull and just straight down. So if these aren't making sense, just ask me, and I'll show you. I can show you tomorrow or later today, depending on when you come in. And I can just show you visually what those look like. So that way, if you are having problems trying to visualize what these planes are, I can definitely show you. So, okay, so there is a hierarchy that we follow when we're going through the body. And so we're going to start at the bottom in terms of classification here. And basically what it means is kind of like a normal pyramid. Every level depends on the one below it. So with this one, everything starts with a macromolecule. I don't know if you remember these very well, but these were the like the carbs, lipids, and proteins. So whole bunch of these are a whole bunch of macromolecules are going to make up an organelle. If you put a whole bunch of organelles working together, keyword there is working together, you can get a cell, since cells are made up of organelles for the most part. Whole bunch of cells working together, keyword working together, you're going to get a tissue. But a whole bunch of tissues that are working together, you're going to get an organ. You get a whole bunch of organs working together to do one job, and you will end up with an organ system. You put a whole bunch of organ systems together and you get a body. Okay, so that's your organization. You'll want to be familiar with that. Okay, then we've got your body cavities. So with your body cavities, these are big spaces that contain organs, and their main job is to help protect your organs from being damaged by anything. What's not filled up by the organs themselves, generally there's some fluid in there to kind of help with cushioning and extra protection. So, 4 major cavities. The first one is the cranial cavity, and that's pretty self-explanatory. It's going to protect your brain. Then you're going to have your spinal cavity, which is going to protect your spinal cord. Again, that one's fairly simple. Then you've got your thoracic cavity, which is going to be your chest cavity. And then your next one is actually can be divided into 2 subcavities. So I'll give you the big one. It's called the abdominal pelvic cavity. And that can be divided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. They're going to protect your reproductive and digestive organs. So the abdominal cavity is going to protect your digestive organs, and your pelvic cavity is going to protect your reproductive organs. Okay, so I've got that diagram there for you. So, okay. Few membranes. So inside of your cavities, you've got these layers of tissues that are going to kind of line the insides of those cavities. So they're going to be found, so you're going to have your cavity wall, these membranes, and then the organs themselves. So if you've ever dissected before, you can see these because they're just little sacs almost that you have to cut through. So in your thoracic cavity, you've got 2 subcavities called a pleural and a pericardial cavity. The pericardial cavity is inside of the pleural cavity. No, just kidding, sorry. The pleural cavity goes around your lungs. The pericardial cavity kind of goes around your heart. They're not hollowed out spaces. They're more like sacs, like pleural sacs and pericardial sacs. It would probably be a better word, but technically I believe they're lumped in as a cavity. So the parietal pleura, is going to be that membrane that's going to cover the inside of your thoracic cavity. So it's going to line the inside of that thoracic cavity. Then inside of that, you've got your pleura, that's going to go around your lungs. That's called the visceral pleura. So 2 layers of membranes here. Your parietal pleura, which goes around everything in the thoracic cavity, and then there's a smaller sac that goes around your lungs, and that's your visceral pleura, which it would be one of those subcavities. Then you've got a smaller one called the pericardium, which just goes around your heart. So if you look here, I've got your pleural cavity, which is like just what the lungs would be, and then your pericardium's right here. Okay, this little sac right here, this green line, that's going to be your pericardium. And they've kind of blown this up here. So you've got your lung here, you've got the other body parts. So this would technically be in your thoracic cavity. So the little membrane that's sandwiched in between here is the parietal pleura. Okay. All right. Last thing that I'm going to go over today are the cranial cavities and sinuses. So there are, just like we've been going over everything else, there are some subcavities here in the cranium. You have your nasal cavity, which contributes for your air passageway, allows air to go through. Then you've got your oral cavity, which is where food would come through. And you've got your ocular cavity, which is where your eyes are located. Okay, then you have these lovely things called sinuses. We don't really know. They're more hollow spaces in your head. We're not really sure what their function is. Sometimes I wonder if the only function they have is just to get infected, so you have a sinus infection and cause headaches. So whenever you have a sinus headache, it's an irritation within your sinuses there. So, like I said, we don't really know what their function is. But you've got 2. You've got your frontal sinus, which is located kind of up here, behind directly in the forehead. That's one sinus. That's your frontal sinus. Then we've got a second sinus, which is kind of behind your eye. Back here, it's called the sphenoid sinus. So that's why when you have a sinus headache, most times it's behind your eye or right up in the front of your forehead there, because it's your sinuses that are being irritated. So that will kind of wrap all of that up. So we'll go over the body systems tomorrow. So I figured that would be enough for today. So if you have any questions, just let me know. Have a good day.